The day Alice Ford was supposed to marry Gerald Whitmore was the day she finally understood that a cage dressed in white lace was still a cage. She had been standing in the small room behind the church in Coldwater Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1879, her fingers trembling as she pressed them flat against the front of her wedding gown, listening to the murmur of 100 guests shuffling into their pews. The town had gathered. Every soul in Coldwater Creek had come to watch the Ford girl marry Gerald Whitmore, the wealthiest cattle rancher in the county, a man who smiled with his teeth and calculated with his eyes. Her father had arranged it all with a handshake and a bottle of bourbon, and Alice had said yes because she had not yet learned what it meant to say no. But now, standing in that room with the smell of candle wax and pine resin thick in the air, she heard Gerald's voice just outside the door. He was talking to one of his ranch hands, and his voice carried a quiet, cold confidence that sent a chill straight through her. "Once it's done," Gerald said, "the Ford land transfers. That's what this is. The girl's just part of the arrangement." There was a pause, and then a low laugh from the other man. Alice stood perfectly still. Her whole body had gone tight, the way a wire fence goes tight when something wild and desperate pushes against it. The land. Her mother's land. The small homestead her mother had broken her back to build before she had passed on 3 winters ago, leaving it in trust to Alice until she came of age or married. Gerald had known exactly what he was doing from the very first time he had brought her wildflowers and removed his hat at her door. She had known something was wrong. She had felt it for months, a slow wrongness that crept through her chest like cold creek water. But she had pressed it down, told herself it was nerves, told herself this was simply what life looked like for a woman in a small Colorado town in 1879. You married who your father chose. You kept a good house. You endured. But the word endured sat in her chest now like a stone, and Alice Ford was 22 years old and she had never once in her life chosen herself. So she ran. She did not think it through. She grabbed the edge of her skirts in both fists, opened the side door of the church that faced the tree line, and she ran into the forest like something that had just remembered it had legs. Behind her she heard nothing for a long moment, and then distantly the sound of voices rising in confusion as someone discovered the empty room. The pine forest swallowed her immediately. It was cool and dense, the trees so close together that the morning light only fell through in thin gold stripes, and Alice ran until she could not hear the town anymore, until her breath came in ragged pulls and her slippers were torn and wet from the undergrowth. She had no coat. She had no horse. She had the clothes on her back and a small locket around her neck that had belonged to her mother, and that was all. She ran toward the sound of water. She had come to this part of the forest once as a girl, chasing after a rabbit with her mother on a warm afternoon, and she remembered the sound of a falls somewhere to the north, a place where the mountain pushed a cold stream over a limestone shelf and sent it crashing down into a pool below. She had thought of that waterfall sometimes in her worst nights, the way you think of the only calm place you have ever known when the world becomes too loud. She found it after what must have been an hour of hard walking through the trees. The falls were exactly as she remembered, taller than she had realized as a child, the water white and furious as it dropped 15 feet from the shelf above into the clear pool below. A wide curtain of spray rose from the base, and behind the main pour of water there was a narrow ledge of stone, dry in the shadow, half hidden from anyone standing on the forest side of the pool. Alice picked her way along the slippery bank, her wedding gown soaked through to the knee, her dark hair coming loose from its careful pins and falling in damp ropes around her face. She pressed herself into the space behind the waterfall, sat down on the dry stone ledge, pulled her knees to her chest, and cried. She cried for a long time. She cried for her mother, who had not lived to see how badly this had all gone. She cried for her father, who had sold her for a handshake without a thought for what she wanted. She cried for herself, for 22 years of swallowing her own voice whole. And then, when the crying was finished, She pressed her back against the cold stone and watched the white curtain of falling water and felt something strange settle over her, something that was not quite peace but was at least quiet. The world outside was muffled behind the falls. Gerald Whitmore and his plans and her father's arrangements in Coldwater Creek, and all of it were on the other side of a wall of water, and for this one moment none of it could reach her. She stayed there through the morning and into the afternoon, dozing lightly against the stone wall, starting awake every time a branch cracked on the far side of the pool. The forest sounds were all around her, the calling of a Steller's jay high in the pines, the rush of the water, the distant knock of a woodpecker. She was cold and hungry and her feet ached, but she was not, for the first time in a very long time, afraid of the moment ahead of her. She was afraid of many other things, but not of the next moment. It was late afternoon, the light going amber through the trees, when she heard something that was not a forest sound. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, moving along the far bank of the pool with the careful confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Alice pressed flat against the stone behind the waterfall, watching through the translucent curtain of water as a figure emerged from between the trees on the opposite bank. He was enormous. That was the first thing she registered. He was tall and wide through the shoulder in a way that had nothing to do with padding or posture, and everything to do with the kind of hard physical work that reshapes a man's body over years. He wore a canvas coat open over a worn flannel shirt, and even from across the pool she could see the thickness of his arms, the muscle-heavy line of his chest. His hair was dark brown, and it was longer than men in town wore it, curling slightly at the collar of his coat. He had a beard, full, but trimmed enough to show the strong line of his jaw beneath it. He carried a long rifle over one shoulder and had a worn leather pack across the other, and he moved through the edge of the forest with an ease that suggested he had been moving through forests like this one for most of his life. He stopped at the edge of the pool. He looked directly at the waterfall. Not at the banks, not at the trees behind it, but at the waterfall itself, and then slowly, with the patience of a man who was not in any hurry and never had been, he pulled his gaze across the surface of the pool until he looked at exactly the spot where Alice was pressed against the stone wall. "You can come out," he said. His voice was low, carrying easily over the sound of the water. "I'm not going to tell anybody where you are." Alice did not move. He set his pack down on a flat rock at the water's edge and crouched beside it, opening the top flap with unhurried hands. "I've been tracking a deer trail up this ridge since this morning," he said conversationally, as if they were sitting at a table together. "Saw the footprints in the bank mud about a quarter-mile south. Small, female, recent." He glanced up at the waterfall again, and even through the water Alice could see the directness of his gaze. "Town's been shouting for you all day. Heard it echo up the ridge." Alice said nothing. He pulled something from his pack, a cloth-wrapped bundle, and set it on the flat rock beside him. He unwrapped it carefully, and even from across the pool she could smell it. Smoked meat. Her stomach made a sound that was deeply undignified. "My name's Seth Holloway," he said. "I've got a camp about 2 miles up the North Ridge. Nobody comes up there unless I bring them." He rewrapped the cloth with the same care he had used to open it and stood, then set the bundle on a dry rock at the pool's edge, close enough to the water that she could reach it if she chose. He took one step back. "I'm not a man who drags women back to places they ran from, just so you know where I stand." There was a long silence in which the waterfall said everything and nothing. Then Alice Ford stood up, lifted the hem of her ruined wedding gown, and picked her way along the ledge and out from behind the waterfall. She stood at the pool's edge and looked at him across the water. She was wet and disheveled, and her hair was a lost cause, and she was wearing the single most impractical garment in existence for standing in a Colorado forest. And she looked at him with the direct, level gaze of a woman who had just made the most consequential decision of her life and was not going to look away from it. He looked back at her with the same directness. Up close he was even more broadly built than she had first understood, his hands thick and capable, the lines of his face weathered and honest. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, maybe 32 or 33, a face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors and carried the map of it. His eyes were gray, a quiet storm gray that did not flinch. "Seth Holloway," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Alice Ford." "I know who you are," he said, not unkindly. "Just plainly. I expect the whole county does today," she said. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. He nodded at the bundle on the rock. "Eat something. You look like you've been running since dawn." She had. She crossed carefully around the edge of the pool, picked up the bundle and unwrapped it. It was smoked elk, dense and dark, and she ate several pieces standing right there at the water's edge with the waterfall roaring behind her. She did not apologize for how hungry she was. Seth Holloway sat on a rock a respectful distance away and did not watch her eat, which she appreciated more than she would have been able to articulate right then. When she was done, she rewrapped the remaining meat and held it out to him. "Keep it," he said. "I've got more at camp." She looked at him. "You said nobody comes to your camp unless you bring them." "That's right. Are you offering to bring me?" He was quiet for a moment. The jay called again somewhere in the high branches. Seth looked at her ruined slippers and then at the shadows that were beginning to gather between the trees, longer and darker as the afternoon wore toward evening. "It'll be cold tonight," he said. 40 degrees, maybe lower at this elevation. That gown isn't going to be enough." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." "And they'll keep searching tomorrow," he said. "They'll cover the low ground first. Nobody much comes up the north ridge except me and the elk." Alice looked back at the waterfall, at the curtain of white water that had held her safe all day. "All right," she said. "Take me to your camp." He stood, picked up his pack and his rifle, and looked at her slippers again with an expression that was not quite pain but was close to it. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks. "Put these on your feet at least. The stones are going to be rough." She took them and pulled them on over her torn slippers without argument. They were several sizes too large and made her look slightly ridiculous. But they were warm, and she was not in any position to be particular. They walked north through the trees as the evening came down, Seth moving with that same deliberate ease she had noticed from across the pool, setting his pace to hers without making a performance of it. He did not try to carry her or hold her arm or fuss at her. He simply walked and held branches aside when the trail narrowed, and occasionally stopped to check his bearings by the angle of the light through the canopy. "How long have you been in the mountains?" she asked, after they had been walking for a while. "Since I was 19, he said. "Came west from Tennessee, trapped for a couple years, then found I liked the high country well enough to stay." "Do you go into town often?" "Once a month for supplies, sometimes less." She thought about that. "You must know what it looks like," she said. "A woman in a wedding dress hiking up a mountain." "I've seen stranger things," he said without missing a step. She almost laughed. It surprised her so much that she pressed her lips together hard to keep it in. His camp was set in a natural hollow on the north ridge, sheltered on 3 sides by a curve of rock that blocked the wind and held the heat of the fire well. There was a log cabin there, small and solid, the kind of structure built by someone who intended to stay warm. A stack of split wood stood against the south wall, head high and neatly ordered. A lean-to shelter adjacent to the cabin held his mule and a second animal, a stocky little pinto mare that nickered when she heard them coming up the trail. Inside, the cabin was simple and deliberate in the way that things built by careful hands tend to be. An iron stove in the center, a narrow bunk along the back wall with a thick buffalo robe and 2 wool blankets folded on top of it, a rough table, 2 chairs. Shelves along one wall holding provisions, tools, and books, more books than she would have expected, their spines worn from reading. He lit the stove while she stood just inside the door and looked at the books. Emerson, Cooper, a volume of poetry she did not recognize, a Bible well thumbed, a natural history of the Rocky Mountains with a loose piece of paper marking a page. "You read a great deal," she said. "Winters are long up here," he said, feeding wood into the stove. He heated water in a tin pot and produced, somewhat magically, a dry set of clothes from a trunk near the bunk. A pair of heavy wool trousers that would have been enormous on her, a flannel shirt, thick wool socks. He set them on the chair near the stove without comment and went outside to see to the animals, giving her privacy to change. She peeled the wedding gown off. It fell to the floor in a heap of wet white satin and ripped lace, and she looked at it for a moment lying there, and felt a great deal of things that she could not have put into precise words. Then she stepped over it and dressed in Seth Holloway's clothes, rolling the trouser legs up 4 times and tying the shirt at her waist with a strip of rawhide she found on the shelf. She pulled the 2 large wool socks on and sat in the chair nearest the stove, and let the heat move back into her bones. When Seth came back inside, he glanced at the wedding gown on the floor and then at her, and something shifted in his expression, a quiet recognition of the magnitude of what she had done today. He said nothing about it. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, rolled his sleeves to the elbow without thinking about it, and began making supper. His arms were remarkable. She noticed this and then looked at the stove. He made a simple supper of beans and salt pork from the larder, with cornbread cooked in a cast iron pan on the stovetop. It was the best food she had eaten in months. She had been so anxious in the weeks leading up to the wedding that she had barely been able to eat, and now that the thing she had been dreading was behind her, she discovered she was ravenous. She ate 2 helpings of everything, and Seth ate with the uncomplicated thoroughness of a man who did hard physical work and required a corresponding amount of fuel. They sat across the table from each other in the firelight, and she found, unexpectedly, that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has substance to it, that is shared rather than imposed. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally when the bowls were pushed aside. She considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I don't have money. I have the land my mother left me, but Gerald's lawyers have probably already started on that since I didn't go through with the wedding. I have no family except my father, and he'll be more angry than worried." She pressed her fingers flat on the table the way she had pressed them against her gown that morning. "I know how it looks." "How does it look?" "Like a foolish girl who ran away from a good match because she got frightened." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what it was?" "No," she said. "I ran because I heard him tell one of his hands that the wedding was about the land transfer. That I was just part of the arrangement." She said it without drama, as flatly as it had happened. "He never wanted me. He wanted my mother's homestead." Seth's jaw set. She could see it even under the beard. "That's not a good match," he said. "That's a transaction." "Try explaining that to my father," she said. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the fire. "He'll say I shamed the family. He'll say Gerald is the best I was going to get and I threw it away out of emotion." "Maybe you did," Seth said. "But that doesn't mean you were wrong." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire too, his thick forearms resting on the table, and the firelight did interesting things to the planes of his face, the strong nose, the deep-set eyes, the patient line of his mouth. "You're not what I expected," she said. "When you came through the trees and said you weren't going to drag me back. What did you expect? I thought you might be one of Gerald's men." "I work for nobody," he said simply. "Never have, not since Tennessee." She wanted to ask about Tennessee, about what had driven a 19-year-old boy out of a southern state and up into the Colorado high country to spend his life among the elk and the pine trees. But she was tired, deeply, bone-finally tired, and the warmth of the stove was making her eyes heavy. He saw it. He stood and made her a place to sleep in the bunk, piling the buffalo robe and blankets into a nest of warmth, and then announced that he would sleep rolled in his bedroll near the stove. She tried to protest this arrangement, and he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "Go to sleep, Miss Ford," in a tone that was so firm and so kind at once that she went to sleep. She woke in the gray pre-dawn to the sound of him moving quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. Through the one small window she could see the mountains still in darkness, the trees black shapes against a sky beginning to go blue at the edges. She lay still for a moment and took stock of where she was and what she had done, and she waited for the panic to set in. It did not come. Instead, there was something that she could only describe as relief, a physical release of tension that had been living in her chest for so long that she had stopped noticing it was there. She got up and accepted the tin cup of coffee he handed her, and they sat by the fire in the early quiet, and the morning came up around them. Over the following days, a shape emerged. Seth went about his work in the high country, checking his traps, hunting, cutting, and splitting wood against the coming summer storms that could still turn bitter on the upper ridges in May. Alice, who had never been anything but a farm girl before her father had gotten aspirational ideas, found that she could be useful. She cooked while he was out, and she was a good cook, having learned from her mother before her illness. She mended things. She explored the area immediately around the camp carefully, learning the ground, the sound of the creek to the east, the way the light moved across the granite rock face above the hollow. On the second day, she washed the wedding gown in the creek and hung it on the fence of the lean-to to dry. She did not know what she was saving it for. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps she simply could not bring herself to leave it as a heap on the cabin floor. On the third day, Seth brought her a pair of boots. He had ridden down to a trading post 8 miles south, not Coldwater Creek, a different one, and had come back with the boots and a second pair of heavy trousers and 2 more shirts and a coat. He set them on the table and told her the total cost with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who was not making a gift but was making a practical adjustment to a practical problem, and she told him she would pay him back. "You can pay me in cornbread," he said. She looked at him. He was washing trail dust from his face and hands at the basin by the door, and the late afternoon light came through the window and caught the brown of his hair and the width of his shoulders, and she looked away at the boots on the table. They were good boots. Sturdy, well-made, exactly the right thing. She put them on. They fit nearly perfectly, which meant he had paid attention to the size of her feet in those torn slippers, and that small fact sat in her chest in a way she did not examine too closely. On the fourth day, she asked him about Tennessee. They were sitting outside in the evening, on the flat rocks in front of the cabin, watching the light die behind the peaks to the west. The sky went through shades of orange and rose that seemed excessive, the way the mountain sunsets always did, as if the sky were trying to make a point. "My father had a farm," he said after a moment. "Big one. Tobacco mostly. We had help to work it." He paused. Help is what people called it then. She understood what he meant. The Colorado mountains were a long way from the south in more ways than miles. "It didn't sit right with me," he said. "Never did. My father said I was soft. I said I was leaving." He looked at the peaks. "I was 19. I went west and I kept going until the mountains were between me and everything I'd come from." "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Tennessee?" "No," he said. "I miss what it could have been. That's different." She thought about that. She thought about her mother's homestead, the small house and the garden plot, and the way the morning light used to come through the kitchen window and make her mother squint and smile. She thought about how the land itself had nothing to do with Gerald Whitmore, had existed long before him, and would go on existing whether or not he ever got his hands on it. "My mother built that homestead from nothing," she said. "After my father drank away the first one, she worked that ground herself, kept us fed, kept us warm. When she got sick, she put the land in trust for me because she knew if she left it to my father, he'd either drink it or gamble it." She looked at her hands. "Gerald Whitmore figured out that if he married me, the land came with me. My father figured out that if he pushed me toward Gerald, Gerald would settle his debts." She paused. "Two men decided what my life was going to be, and they never once asked me what I thought." Seth was quiet for a long time. The sky finished its elaborate performance and went to purple. "What do you think?" he said. Nobody had asked her that question in so long that it took her a moment to understand what he meant. "I think I want the land back," she said, "and I think I want to work it myself." Something in his face settled, as if she had answered something he had been quietly wondering about her. "Then that's worth fighting for," he said. "You think a woman can fight a man like Gerald Whitmore?" "I think a woman who ran from a church full of people and hiked up a mountain in a wedding dress can do about anything she decides to do," he said. She laughed. It came out genuine, surprised, and she pressed a hand over her mouth as if she could take it back, but Seth was smiling now, an actual full smile that rearranged his whole face and made him look for a moment much younger. It was a devastating smile. She looked back at the mountains. After a week, the shape of her days had become something she would have been startled to call comfortable, but that was the most accurate word for it. She was comfortable here in this hollow on the North Ridge, with the sound of the falls 2 miles south, and the pines pressing in around the cabin, and Seth Holloway moving through his world with that quiet, capable certainty that made everything around him seem steadier. She had begun to admit to herself in the early mornings when she was still half asleep, completely distracted by him. The way he carried himself, the uncomplicated physical presence of him, broad and warm and unhurried. The way he listened, with his full attention and without planning what he was going to say next. The way he had brought her boots without making it a moment of charity, without expecting gratitude, without making her feel like a burden or a rescue. The way he sometimes looked up from whatever he was doing and found her across the cabin and said nothing, just looked. The way you look at something you are still making sense of. She told herself this was gratitude. She told herself this was the disorientation of upheaval, that she was clinging to the nearest solid thing because her world had been turned over. She told herself several sensible, rational things, and they were all correct, and none of them were the whole truth. On the 8th day, Gerald Whitmore's men came up the ridge. There were 3 of them. Alice heard the horses first, the creak and clop of their approach through the trees, and she went to the cabin window and looked out and felt her stomach go cold. She recognized 2 of them from the ranch. The third was a man she did not know, heavyset, with a badge on his coat. Seth had heard them too. He was already on his feet, his rifle easy in his hands, standing in the open door of the cabin in a way that made very clear the cabin was behind him and would be staying that way. The man with the badge pulled his horse up at the edge of the clearing. "Name's Deputy Crane. Looking for a woman named Alice Ford. She's reported missing." "Missing," Seth said. Not a question, not a challenge, just the word returned to the air with perfect flatness. "That's right. Her intended and her father are both worried sick." The deputy's eyes went past Seth to the cabin window. Alice stepped back from the glass, but she suspected he had already seen her. "A woman who's missing doesn't tend to be found sitting in a warm cabin," Seth said. "That's usually just a woman who went somewhere else." The deputy shifted in the saddle. "Sir, if you're harboring—" "I'm not harboring anything," Seth said. "If the woman you're looking for wanted to come with you, she'd come with you. That's her business." He looked at the 2 ranch hands with the same level gray gaze. "You can tell Mr. Whitmore she's not lost and she's not his concern." One of the ranch hands, a lean man with sunburned hands named Doyle that Alice had always thought looked like trouble, leaned forward in the saddle. "Now listen here. I wasn't speaking to you," Seth said pleasantly, and something in his size, in the unhurried certainty of the way he stood, made Doyle sit back. The deputy looked at Seth for a long moment. Seth looked back with the patience of a man who had absolutely nowhere else to be. "Sir, there's a legal matter of the land trust," the deputy began. "Then that's a matter for a court," Seth said. "And a lawyer, not for 3 men on horses on my land." A pause. The horses shifted. The pine trees were very tall and very still around the clearing. "Tell her," the deputy said finally, his tone tired, "that her father wants to hear from her." "I'll pass that along," Seth said. They rode back down the ridge. Seth watched them until the sound of hooves faded entirely, and then he came back inside and closed the door and leaned his rifle against the wall. Alice was standing in the middle of the cabin with her arms crossed over her chest. "Thank you," she said. "They'll come back," he said. "Whitmore's not the type to let it go." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to need to decide what you're going to do, Alice. Not because I want you gone, but because the choice is yours and it should be made while you have time to make it well." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address, and she felt it like a change in temperature. She sat down at the table and looked at the books on the shelf and thought hard. "The land trust was written by my mother's lawyer," she said slowly. "A man named Aldrich in Colorado Springs. He's honest. My mother trusted him completely. If the trust is clear enough, Whitmore can't take the land just because I didn't marry him. Can you get to Colorado Springs? If I had a horse and I wasn't afraid of running into Whitmore's people on the road." Seth was quiet for a moment. "I'll take you," he said. She looked at him. "Seth, that's 3 days' ride." "I know how long it is," he said. "I've made the trip. You'd leave your camp. The camp will be here when I get back." She looked at him for a long time, this man who had no particular reason to take on her troubles, who had found her hiding behind a waterfall and fed her and clothed her, and stood between her and Gerald Whitmore's hands without so much as raising his voice, and who was now offering to ride 3 days through the mountains to a city he had no business in on her behalf. "Why?" she said. "Why are you doing all of this?" He seemed to consider the question the way he considered most things, carefully, without hurrying. "Because it's the right thing," he said, "and because you're worth doing the right thing for." She did not know what to do with that. She looked at the table. "And," he said more quietly, "because I'd like to see you land on your feet." They left the next morning before dawn, Seth on his big gray gelding and Alice on the pinto mare, riding south and east through the mountain passes with the cold air sharp in their lungs, and the sky just beginning to lighten above the peaks. Seth had packed the saddlebags with enough provisions for 5 days, and had added to Alice's saddlebag a wool blanket and the small volume of poetry from his shelf, which she discovered when she went to put her own things in and looked up at him questioningly. "Long rides get dull," he said. She tucked the book back in carefully, and they rode out into the lifting dark. The mountain trail was rough and wild, the kind of country that made it obvious why people had been slow to settle it. The passes were still cold at this elevation even in May, patches of snow and the north-facing shadows between the pines, the air thin and biting. But it was also, Alice thought, riding along behind Seth as the sun came fully up and turned everything gold and pale, the most beautiful country she had ever seen in her life. She had spent her whole existence in or near Coldwater Creek, a serviceable little town built in the crease of a valley, and she had not understood, not really, how much larger the world above that valley was. She said as much, and Seth half turned in the saddle to look at her and then looked back at the trail ahead. "It always surprises people," he said, "the first time they get above the valley floor and see how much sky there is. Is that what you liked about it?" she asked. "When you first came west?" "That," he said, "and the fact that nobody here knew who my father was." She understood that more than she could say. She had spent her whole life in a town where everyone knew who her father was, which meant everyone knew exactly what to expect from her and exactly how much to discount her. "Nobody in Colorado Springs will know who I am," she said to herself as much as to him. "That's right," he said. "You're just Alice Ford, which is, from where I'm standing, plenty." She felt the warmth of that settle into her chest and stay there. They made camp that first night in a sheltered bend of a creek below the tree line, Seth setting up with the same efficient economy he brought to everything. A fire laid and burning before she had finished unsaddling the mare, the horses watered and picketed, beans and hardtack appearing from the saddlebag with calm inevitability. They sat across the fire from each other in the dark, the creek running nearby, the vast sky above them salted thick with stars. Alice had never seen the stars from this far above a town before. The Milky Way was not an abstract idea up here. It was a physical presence, a great river of light above the peaks. "There's the whole rest of the world up there," she said quietly, looking up. "All of it," Seth agreed. "I was so afraid," she said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. I was so afraid for so long that I almost let it swallow me whole." She looked across the fire at him. The flames made shifting patterns of light and shadow across his face. "The fear was bigger than anything else. Bigger than what I wanted, bigger than what I knew was wrong. Fear of my father being disappointed. fear of having nothing. Fear of being alone. She shook her head slowly. I didn't even realize how small I'd let it make me until I was standing in that room behind the church listening to Gerald talk about me like a land parcel. Seth was looking at her with that full, patient attention. Fear does that, he said. It's got weight to it, presses you down until you can't see past the thing right in front of you. How do you stop it? He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. You don't stop it, he said. You just start moving. Fear tends to loosen its grip once you're in motion. It works best when you're standing still. She thought about running from the church. About that first moment of stepping through the side door and feeling the cold morning air hit her face and the ground under her feet as she ran into the trees. She had been terrified. She had also, in that exact same instant, felt more alive than she had felt in years. I started moving, she said. You did, he said. And you haven't stopped. She looked at him across the fire and felt something happen to the center of her chest. A slow, significant shift, like the way a stone settles deeper into a river bed when the current runs true over it. She looked at the stars. She did not look at Seth again for a while because if she did, she thought she might say something that could not be unsaid. The second day of riding took them down out of the high country and into the broader valleys of the Front Range, the land opening up into rolling grassland broken by stands of cottonwood along the creek beds. The sky expanded overhead as the mountains fell back on the western horizon. The temperature rose enough that Alice shed her coat by midday and rode with her face turned up toward the sun, feeling it warm and ordinary on her skin. Seth pointed out things as they rode. A red-tailed hawk circling over a field, the track of a pronghorn crossing the trail, the ruins of an old adobe structure half collapsed into the grass, which he said had been a trading post burned out during a conflict he described without dramatics, just the plain facts of what had happened and why. She listened to him and looked at the country through his eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent more than a decade learning to read the land the way other people read books. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, in the easy, comfortable way she had begun to ask him things, without preamble. He considered it. "Sometimes," he said, "winters mostly. The cabin gets quiet in a way that's different from ordinary quiet. What do you do? Read, work, think about things, a pause. Wonder about things. What kind of things?" He did not answer right away, and she had learned enough about him to know that a silence from Seth Holloway was not avoidance but consideration. "I wonder what I'm building toward," he said finally. "A man can be self-sufficient and still wonder what it's all in service of. A good camp, good horses, good books." He looked out at the grassland ahead. "It starts to feel like preparation for something. I'm just not always sure what." The thought hung between them in the warm afternoon air. Alice did not fill it with words. They reached Colorado Springs on the afternoon of the third day, coming into the town from the west along a road that turned quickly from dirt track to something approaching a proper street, lined on both sides with the planked frontages of shops and offices and the newer brick buildings that spoke to the town's ambitions. Colorado Springs was not quite a city in 1879, but it was trying hard to be one, and after a week in the mountain hollow, the noise and press of it felt startling to Alice's recalibrated senses. Seth navigated the streets with the wary efficiency of a man who tolerated towns rather than enjoyed them, and he found a respectable boarding house within 15 minutes of their arrival, negotiated 2 rooms with the landlady, and deposited their horses at the livery next door. Alice had not asked how he was managing the money for all of this. She intended to make that right as soon as she had made everything else right. The lawyer Aldrich's office was on the main street, above a dry goods shop. They went that afternoon. Mr. Aldrich was a small, precise man in his 50s with steel-rimmed spectacles and the manner of a man who had seen a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. He looked at Alice when she came through his door, still in Seth's trail-worn clothes with her hair braided over one shoulder, and then at Seth standing behind her, and something in the old lawyer's face settled into something like relief. "Miss Ford," he said, "I have been expecting you might come." She sat across from him at his desk, and Seth took a position near the door, his hat in his hands, silent and present. The lawyer laid the trust document out on the desk and walked her through it carefully. Her mother had been a precise woman, and she had worked with a precise lawyer, and the language of the trust was clear. The land could not be transferred by any means other than Alice's own written consent, freely given without coercion. The unfinished marriage to Gerald Whitmore triggered no land transfer of any kind, because no such transfer had been written into the trust or into any legal document. Gerald Whitmore had, it appeared, been operating on a verbal understanding with Alice's father which was legally meaningless. "He has no claim," the lawyer said, tapping the document. "None. The land is yours, unencumbered, and has been since your 21st birthday." Alice sat very still for a moment and then let out a long, careful breath. "He was so certain," she said. "Mr. Whitmore is used to certainty," the lawyer said dryly. "He is less used to land trust language written by a thorough woman." He removed his spectacles and polished them. "Your mother, Miss Ford, was a very thorough woman." Alice pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. The grief of it, the love of it, came up unexpectedly hot behind her eyes, and she pressed it back down with effort. "Yes," she said when she could. "She was." The lawyer drew up a formal statement of Alice's ownership, signed and sealed it, and gave her a copy. He also wrote a letter to the county clerk in Coldwater Creek, confirming the legal status of the property, and pointedly, the absence of any enforceable claim by Gerald Whitmore or anyone acting on his behalf. Outside, on the boardwalk in the Colorado Springs afternoon, Alice stood with the papers folded in her coat pocket and the May sunlight warm on her face, and felt the last of the fear, the specific fear she had been carrying since the church door, release its grip on her completely. Seth stood beside her. He was looking at the street, giving her the privacy of the moment, and she turned and looked at the side of his face, the weathered jaw, the patient line of his profile. "She built something real," Alice said. "My mother, she built something real, and she made sure it would hold." "She built it for you," Seth said. "Yes." Alice looked at the papers in her pocket. "And now I have to figure out what to build on top of it." He looked at her then, and those gray eyes were very direct and very warm at once, and she felt again that settling sensation in her chest, deeper this time, unmistakable. "I have a thought about that," he said carefully, "if you want to hear it." "I want to hear it," she said. He looked at the street again. He was, she had noticed, a man who found it easier to say difficult true things when he was not looking directly at you. It was not cowardice, she had concluded. It was the opposite, a form of care, a giving of space. "The North Ridge is a good place to build," he said. "The hollow where the camp is. Good water, good shelter, south-facing for the sun. A man could put up a proper house there in a summer if he had help." He paused. "A man and a woman, working together, could do it in half the time and do it better." She did not say anything. "I know you've had enough of men making decisions for you," he said. "So I'm not deciding anything. I'm just telling you that the hollow is big enough for more than one person, and I'd like for you to be the second one." Another pause. "I'm not a man given to dramatic speeches. I'll just say that you're the most remarkable person I've met in 13 years in the mountains, and I'd like the chance to know you better, and if you'll stay I will spend whatever time you give me being worth your while." Alice looked at him for a long time. The street went about its business around them. Horses and boot heels and the distant sound of a hammer somewhere in the new construction on the east end. The mountains were a blue line on the western horizon, capped in white, where the hollow waited in its pine-sheltered certainty. "Seth," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me," she said. "Don't tell me the space exists and let me infer." "Ask me." The corner of his mouth moved. "Will you come back to the ridge with me, Alice Ford?" "Yes," she said. "I will." The warmth that moved across his face at that single syllable was the kind of expression a person only shows when they have stopped expecting the answer they most wanted to get. They stayed 2 nights in Colorado Springs, partly to rest the horses and partly, Alice suspected, because they had both understood that something between them had shifted, and neither of them, was quite ready to ride back into their ordinary lives without letting the new reality settle around them first. The first night they had supper at a hotel restaurant, which felt slightly surreal to Alice in Seth's trail clothes, but which Seth navigated with an ease that reminded her he had, after all, been a Tennessee farm boy who had learned formal table manners before he had learned to trap elk. He was not unacquainted with the world. He had simply chosen a different part of it. They talked about many things over supper: his years trapping in the high country, her mother's garden, what she remembered of it, the plants her mother had loved, his bookshelves and what had drawn him to them, her fear, as a girl, of a certain preacher in town whose voice had been too loud and whose eyes had been too narrow, and how that fear had translated, she now understood, into a more general fear of the authority of men. His own reckoning with his father, the long years of deciding what he owed to a man who had built something wrong and called it right, and ultimately the understanding that the only thing he owed was to do better himself. She told him about her mother's illness, the slow, terrible winter of it, and he listened with a stillness that was not absence but presence, a witness. She had not told that story to many people. Most people in Coldwater Creek already knew it, and knowing it had not made them interested in her experience of it, only in the facts: who had died, and when, and what had been left. After supper, they walked along the boardwalk in the spring evening, and the town was lit with lantern light from the saloons and shops still open, and the mountains at the western edge of the sky were a dark wall against the last blue of the day. Seth walked beside her and their hands brushed twice, and the third time he turned his palm up slightly without making it a question, and she put her hand in his, and that was how that happened. It was, she thought, the most natural thing that had happened to her in years. They rode back to the ridge over the following 3 days, and the return felt entirely different from the journey out. The same land and sky, but refracted through a different understanding of where they were going and why. They talked more freely. She read aloud from the poetry book in the evenings by the campfire, both of them finding that the old words sat differently under a mountain sky than they would have in a parlor, the language of feeling made larger by the open country. He made her laugh twice on the second day, and both times the laughter surprised her and delighted him, and he looked pleased in a way that made her want to make him feel that way as many times as she possibly could. On the last evening before they reached the ridge, camped in a meadow with the peaks close above them and the first stars coming out, he kissed her. It was not impulsive. He had looked at her for a long moment across the fire, and then stood and came around it and crouched in front of where she sat, and he had looked at her face as if he were making sure of what he saw there, and then he had put his hand against her jaw very carefully and kissed her with a slow, entire tenderness that she felt in her sternum. She kissed him back with her whole self, both hands in the front of his coat, and when they stopped she had her forehead pressed against his, and the mountains were enormous around them, and neither of them said anything because anything either of them might have said would have been redundant. They arrived back at the hollow on the north ridge in the early afternoon of the following day, and it looked exactly as they had left it, the cabin solid and dark in the pine shadow, the lean-to standing, the wood stack undiminished. The falls were audible from here, that perpetual white sound 2 miles south, and Alice stood outside the cabin door and listened to them and looked at the hollow with new eyes. She had a fight ahead of her still. She knew that. Coldwater Creek was not going to quietly absorb what had happened, and her father's anger and Gerald Whitmore's wounded pride were real problems, not ones that a lawyer's letter would make entirely disappear. But she had the letter, and she had the land, and she had the truth, and she was standing in a hollow in the Rocky Mountains in May 1879, next to a man who had walked out of the trees and sat on a rock and waited without pressure for her to come out from behind a waterfall, and there were worse places to begin. Seth went inside to start the stove, and Alice turned back and looked at the south end of the hollow, where the light came through the pines in long afternoon bars, and she thought about what he had said. A proper house. A summer's work. She thought about her mother building the homestead, the long work of it, the slow accumulation of something real. She went inside and stood in the cabin doorway and said, "Show me where you'd put the house." He looked up from the stove where he was laying the fire. He smiled, slow and full. "Now." "Yes," she said. "Now," he showed her. They walked the hollow in the late afternoon, Seth pointing out where the south-facing light was strongest, where the ground was firm, where the spring that fed the camp ran closest to the surface. He sketched the shape of a structure with his hands in the air, big enough for more than the two of them, eventually, built to last. She looked at the space he was describing and tried to see it finished, the way her mother had stood in a field and tried to see a garden. She thought she could. In June, the work began. Seth felled trees from the north side of the hollow where the timber was dense and the forest could spare them, and he taught Alice how to strip the bark with a drawn knife, which was harder than it looked and required a particular angle of attack that her arms learned before her brain did. She developed blisters on both palms in the first week that were ugly and then calloused over, and she was privately pleased by them. She ordered materials from the trading post 8 miles south through Seth's standing arrangement there, glass for windows and nails and lime for chinking. She made 3 careful lists, and she was, it turned out, very good at logistics, a fact she had not previously had occasion to discover. They wrote to the lawyer Aldrich to forward copies of the land trust documents to the county clerk. They received back a short letter confirming that the clerk had recorded them and that Gerald Whitmore's attorneys had been informed of the legal position. There was a separate letter from her father, terse and wounded, demanding she return to Coldwater Creek and face her responsibilities. She wrote back a careful, honest letter that was neither apologetic nor cruel, explaining what she had heard Gerald say in the church room, what she had discovered from the lawyer, and what she had decided to do with her mother's land. She did not ask for his blessing. She did not tell him where she was. She was not certain she was entirely ready to forgive him. But she was not interested in carrying the weight of bitterness either, and she suspected that the truth of the letter, laid out plainly, would do its work over time. Through June and into July, the walls of the new house went up. Seth was a remarkable carpenter, the way skilled people often are remarkable at things, which is to say not with showiness but with economy, every motion purposeful, every joint cleanly made. He had built the cabin with the same economy. She could see it now, and the larger structure rising in the hollow south of it bore the same hallmarks, solid and considered and built for the long haul. Alice worked beside him, and she learned fast, and he taught without condescension, which she would have loved in him for that alone. They were not yet married. This was not lost on either of them, and it was something they discussed honestly on a July evening sitting outside the cabin with the smell of fresh pine sap in the air and the sounds of the high country evening settling in around them. "I'm not in any hurry," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not pushing." "I know you're not," she said. "You're possibly the least pushy person I have ever met. Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It's the exact opposite." He looked at the new house walls standing in the evening light. "But if you wanted, I do want," she said quietly. "I just want it to be my choice, fully my choice, and it is." She looked at him. "It is, Seth. It just has to come in my own time." "Then in your own time," he said. "I'll be here." She reached across and took his hand where it rested on the rock between them, and he turned his palm up and held her hand in that solid, warm grip that she had, some time over the last weeks, come to feel was one of the most reliable things in her world. At the end of July, her father came to the ridge. He came alone, on a hired horse, and she saw him picking his way up the trail from the hollow's edge, and felt her heart do several complicated things at once. James Ford was a man made smaller by his vices, the drinking and the deals. A man who had once been, she thought, someone capable of more than he had become. He looked older than she remembered, and he looked uncomfortable on the horse and uncomfortable in the mountains, and he looked, when he saw her standing in front of the half-finished house in work clothes with paint on her hands, as though several of his assumptions were being dismantled one by one. Seth came from around the side of the house at the sound of the horse, and he stood nearby, not between Alice and her father but present, available. His gaze was on James Ford without being a challenge, just a fact. Her father got down from the horse and looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Alice," he said. "Papa," she said. He looked at the house walls, he looked at the cabin, he looked at Seth, whose size and stillness were not the sort of thing you could look at without registering. He looked back at Alice. "Your mother would have had things to say about this," he began. "Yes," Alice said. "She would have said I was about time." Her father's mouth worked for a moment. He looked at the ground and then at the house walls again. "Whitmore's dropped it," he said finally. "The legal business. His lawyers told him it wasn't worth pursuing. He's been talking to the Hendersons about their daughter over near Pueblo." He cleared his throat. "I thought you'd want to know." "Thank you for coming to tell me," she said. Another silence. The pines were very tall above the hollow and the sky beyond the peaks was enormous and blue. "I didn't know," he said, and something in his voice had changed, gone rougher. "What he said in the church room. I didn't know that's what he thought of it. I thought he was a good prospect, Alice. I thought I was doing right by you." She looked at her father for a long time. He was a flawed man who had made decisions about her life without understanding her life, and he had caused real harm by doing so, and he was also her father, and there was no simple accounting for any of it. "I know you thought that," she said. "I think you should have asked me. I think you should have asked me a long time ago what I thought and what I wanted." She paused. "But I believe you thought you were helping, and I can hold both those things at once." He nodded, once stiffly, the way proud men acknowledge the truths they have not yet fully absorbed. Seth stepped forward and introduced himself with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything, offered his hand, and her father shook it with the look of a man recalibrating several things at once. Seth then said that he was going to check on the horses and left them to talk, which Alice thought was one of the most precisely judged exits she had ever witnessed. Her father stayed for 3 hours. He walked the site of the new house and he asked careful questions about the construction, the practical kind that suggested, despite everything, some actual interest. He ate a meal with them at the table in the cabin and was quieter than usual and looked several times at the bookshelves and at Alice sitting across from Seth, and at the way they moved around each other in the small space with the comfortable unconscious adjustment of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. When he left, riding back down the trail in the afternoon, he stopped his horse at the hollow's edge and turned back. "Your mother would have approved of him," he said. "I think." Alice looked at Seth standing beside her and felt the warmth of those words move through her completely. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." The house was finished in late September, just as the first cold came back to the high country, and the aspens turned gold in the breaks between the pines. It was solid and well-made, 2 real rooms and a loft overhead, with a proper fireplace of mortared stone and windows on the south and east faces that let in the winter light. Alice had planted a garden plot to the south of it in the last warm days of August, putting in what could still be established before the cold, planning the larger planting for spring. She had her mother's plant knowledge, the long, careful education of a childhood spent at a woman's knee in the dirt, and she put it to use now on ground that was her own to tend. On an October afternoon, with the aspen leaves coming down golden in the hollow and the mountains already white above them, and the fireplace going warm and steady in the new house, Seth asked her to marry him. He did it with the same directness and care he brought to everything. He did not kneel, though he would have if she'd asked it of him. He stood in front of her in the house they had built together, and he held her hands in his, and he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes full of everything he had not always had words for, and he said, "I have been more myself since I found you behind that waterfall than I have been in 13 years in these mountains. I know who I am, but I had forgotten what it was for, and you reminded me." He paused. "Marry me, Alice. Not because it's what's done or what's expected or because of anything except that I want to spend whatever time I'm given making a life worth living with you in it." She said yes before he had finished the sentence, and the word came out without fear, without hesitation, without a single reservation. And she felt the difference between that and every other yes she had ever said in her life with the clarity of cold mountain water. They married in November, in Colorado Springs, with the lawyer Aldrich and his wife as witnesses, and the circuit preacher who came through town twice a year. The ceremony was simple, and exactly what Alice wanted. She wore a blue wool dress she had made herself, and Seth wore his good coat and had trimmed his beard and let his hair be tamed down to merely longer than average rather than genuinely wild. And when the preacher asked if she took this man, she felt nothing but the warm certainty of yes. Afterward, Aldrich's wife produced a small cake she had made and brought, and they ate it in the parlor of the lawyer's office because there was no better venue available, and it was, Alice thought, perfect. Exactly perfect. They rode home to the ridge through the first real snow of the season, which had started falling quietly while they were inside, and now lay an inch deep on the trail and was still coming, the flakes fat and silent in the November dark. The horses moved steadily through it. Seth rode beside her close enough that their knees occasionally touched, and the hollow appeared out of the dark ahead of them, the new house's windows lit amber from inside where they had left a lamp burning. She looked at the house standing in the snow and thought about her mother, and about the woman her mother had been, thorough and real and determined. She thought about the waterfall, the white curtain of it in the afternoon light. She thought about Seth's voice coming across the pool, unhurried and plain. "I'm not going to tell anybody where you are." She thought about how the world had been smaller than her fear, how it had pressed in around her like walls. And then she thought about how it had turned out to be so much larger, so much stranger and more generous, so much more full of mountains and gray eyes, and the smell of pine smoke, and the capacity for her own hands to learn new things. The snow fell around them as they rode into the hollow. The first winter in the new house was the kind of winter that tests what a structure is made of, and the house held. It was a cold winter, the mountain kind of cold that has personality to it, and they spent it close to the fireplace. Seth working on equipment and Tack in the workshop leaned to attach to the new house, Alice writing letters and reading, and doing the meticulous winter planning for the spring garden, mapping out beds and seed orders with the same thoroughness her mother had applied to everything. There were long evenings, by the fire with books and conversation. Seth was a different kind of thinker from anyone Alice had known before, patient and exact, the kind of person who sat with an idea until he had understood it from all sides. She was quicker, more intuitive, and she found that the combination of them was productive in a way that neither of them would have been alone. They argued sometimes, genuinely and without rancor, and discovered that a real argument that arrives at its own resolution is one of the most satisfying experiences two people can have together. He told her more about Tennessee in those winter evenings, the things he had carried away from it, and the things he had deliberately left behind. She told him about her mother, the whole of it, not just the end but the long middle, the years of work and laughter and the specific way her mother had of looking at something broken and understanding exactly what needed doing. She told him about being 14 and watching her mother rebuild a collapsed section of fence by herself because her father was indisposed, and how her mother had not complained, not once, just assessed and planned and worked. "She taught you everything," he said one evening. "Everything that mattered," Alice said. "How to think about problems instead of around them. How to do the actual thing instead of worrying about the actual thing." She paused. "She would have been terrified for me when I ran, but she would have understood why. She raised someone who could run," he said. "That means she did it right." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had a way of finding the essential truth of a thing and holding it up without ornamentation, and she felt the love she had for him so clearly in that moment that it was almost alarming. It was the kind of love that had nothing to do with fear and nothing to do with arrangement. It was the love that grows in the space between two people who have chosen each other with full information and no illusions. "Seth," she said, "I love you." He put down the piece of tack he had been repairing and looked at her with that look, the one that remade the planes of his face into something open and young. "I love you, Alice," he said. "I have since about the 4th day after you came out from behind that waterfall and ate my smoked elk like you hadn't seen food in a week." She laughed. "I hadn't eaten properly in weeks." "I know, I could see it." His voice was very quiet. "I wanted to feed you and keep you warm and put myself between you and anything that was going to try to hurt you, and I had known you for approximately 6 hours. "That's very efficient of you," she said. "I'm an efficient man," he said, and picked up the tack again, and his eyes were warm. The spring of 1880 brought the garden to life under Alice's hands in a way that satisfied something deep in her that she had not known was waiting. The soil of the south-facing slope was better than she had hoped, dark and well-drained, and she planted everything her mother had planted, and some things her mother had never had the opportunity to try. By June the beds were orderly and green, and she spent mornings in them the way other people spend mornings in prayer, with a thoroughness and a quietness that was its own kind of communion. Seth expanded his work that spring, taking on a guiding contract with a scientific expedition from Denver that was mapping the high country. He was gone for stretches of a week at a time, and Alice managed the hollow alone during those stretches with a competence that quietly astonished her, not because she had doubted herself, but because the scale of what she was managing was larger than anything she had managed before, and it worked. The animals were tended. The garden grew. The house held its warmth. When he came back from the first guiding stint, he came back with a folded newspaper from Denver and 3 new books from a shop there, and he stood in the doorway of the house and looked at her where she was standing by the south window with the garden visible behind the glass, and he put the things he was carrying down without looking away from her and crossed the room. "I missed you," he said. It was a simple statement, accurate and uncomplicated. "I missed you too," she said. "Very much." She put her hands against his chest. "The hollow is too quiet without you." He put his arms around her, and that was sufficient. Sufficient and more than sufficient. In August of 1880 she told him she was expecting. She told him in the evening after supper, sitting at the table, and she watched his face go through something that was too large and too layered to be called by any single name. He sat very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Are you all right?" he said, the first question, not his own feeling but hers. "I'm well," she said. "I feel well. I felt sick in the early mornings for a few weeks, but that's been easing." He looked at their joined hands. Then he looked at her face, and she saw everything he was feeling move across his features openly, the awe of it, the fear that comes with love's new form, and beneath both of those something that was very much like the expression he had worn on their wedding day when she said yes. "We're going to need to make the loft a proper room," he said finally. She laughed so hard she had to press her face into her hands. The baby was a boy, born in May of 1881, in the house in the hollow with the mountain still white above them, and the aspens putting out their first new leaves, and the falls audible to the south in their spring fullness. The birth was attended by a midwife who lived in the valley below, and who had made the trip up the ridge 3 times in the preceding months, and who was, fortunately, exactly the kind of person you want in a room with you when things are both ordinary and enormous. Seth had stayed close. The midwife had been firm about where he could and could not be during the actual labor, and he had respected this completely while making it clear by his proximity that he was not going anywhere under any circumstances. When the baby arrived and the midwife put him in Alice's arms and Alice looked at the small, emphatically present face of her son, the sound Seth made from the doorway was not something she had ever heard from him before. She looked up at him, this enormous, capable, self-sufficient man, and his face was entirely undone, open in a way that only happened in the moments too large for ordinary composure. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son with those big, careful hands, the same hands that had built the house and split the wood and stood between her and Whitmore's men without flinching, and now were cradling a 6-pound human being with a focused delicacy that made her chest ache with love. "What do we call him?" Seth asked, his voice very low. Alice had thought about this. "William," she said. "After nobody, just because it's a good name." "William Holloway," Seth said. He looked at the baby. "Hello, William." William Holloway opened his eyes, which were the dark, unfocused blue of all new babies, and looked in the general direction of his father's voice with an expression of extreme concentration, as if he were already taking the measure of the situation and finding it acceptable. They named him William James, the James for Alice's father, who had been making slow, uncertain progress toward the kind of man Alice thought he had always had the potential to be. He had come to the Ridge 3 times since the wedding, and each time the visit had been easier, and he had begun to write letters that were less terse and more honest. She was not in any hurry with him. She had decided she had time for people to grow at the pace they were capable of, as long as they were actually growing. William was a large, contented baby who ate well and slept in useful stretches, and seemed to find his father's voice specifically soothing, a fact that delighted Seth to a degree he tried to keep proportional and mostly failed too. He carried the boy around the hollow in the long summer evenings, pointing things out with a patient commentary that the baby could not possibly have understood, but listened to with apparent interest. The way you listen to music in a language you don't speak yet when the music is good enough. Alice watched them from the south window and felt the full weight of everything. The whole long, improbable road from a church room in Coldwater Creek to this hollow in the Rockies, and she felt it with clarity and with gratitude of the specific, grounded kind that comes from having understood what the alternative was. The years on the North Ridge built on each other with the solidity of good construction. The garden expanded. The hollow put down roots, accumulating the small history of a place genuinely lived in, the marks on the door frame where they tracked William's height, the worn stone path from the house to the workshop, the apple tree Seth planted the second spring that took 3 years to be worth anything, and then produced apples of a quality that made no logical sense given the elevation. In 1883, a daughter arrived, whom they named Clara May, and who was from her first morning a person of exceptional opinions loudly expressed, a characteristic both parents found exhausting and secretly marvelous. She was dark-haired like her mother and had her father's gray eyes and absolutely nobody's patience but her own, and she was, Alice thought, exactly who she was supposed to be. Seth's reputation as a guide in the high country grew through the early 1880s, bringing him work from scientists and surveyors and occasionally journalists from the eastern papers who wanted to write about the wilderness of the Front Range. He approached this work with the same economy and directness he brought to everything, taking people through the mountain country with a knowledgeable thoroughness that sent them home with their work done and their admiration intact. The money from guiding added steadily to what the hollow produced, and by the mid-1880s the life they had built was solid in every material sense. But it was the immaterial solidity that Alice thought about when she was quiet. The particular quality of the evenings in the house on the ridge, the fire going, the children asleep in the loft above, Seth reading by the lamp, the falls audible through the south window when the night was quiet enough, the world outside enormous and dark and full of weather, and inside all of this warmth and this person who had looked across a mountain pool at a woman hiding behind a waterfall and not turned away. She had told him once in one of those evenings that she thought about the waterfall sometimes. "I think about it too," he said without looking up from his book. "I think about you standing on that ledge looking at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the risk." "You were," she said. "I'm glad you thought so," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." She looked at him. "You seemed very sure." "I was trying to seem very sure," he said. "I was actually hoping extremely hard." She had loved him before that moment, and she loved him after it with exactly the same wholeness. But that piece of information, that admission that the certainty had been a gift he gave her rather than a thing he simply had, sat in her in a particular way. It made the whole enterprise even more real to her, the two of them meeting each other across a waterfall pool, both of them trying, both of them hoping, both of them choosing. On a May afternoon in 1886, 7 years after the day she had run from the church in Coldwater Creek, Alice Holloway walked down the South Trail with William, who was 5 years old and convinced he could keep up with his mother on any terrain, and Clara, who was 3 and being carried on Alice's hip, to the pool below the falls. The falls were running full with the snowmelt, white and powerful, and the sound of them filled the small canyon with a roar that vibrated in the chest. William went immediately to the edge of the pool and crouched to look at the water with the intense scientific focus he brought to all natural phenomena, which he had inherited from a father who had spent 13 years alone in the mountains getting very good at looking at things carefully. Alice stood at the pool's edge and looked at the waterfall. She could see the ledge behind it, darker than the rock around it, dry in the shadow. The narrow curtain of spray. The way the water fell in a continuous white sheet from the lip of the limestone shelf above. She was 29 years old. She had strong hands and good boots and a garden that was, by this point, the best producing kitchen garden for 30 miles in any direction. She had a house she had helped to build, and a lawyer's letter in a tin box that confirmed the land was hers and remained hers. She had a husband who was, she had concluded without reservation, and with enormous evidence, the best person she had ever known. She had 2 children who were both already entirely themselves in ways that amazed her daily. She had not known any of this was possible on the morning she had stood in the church room, listening to Gerald Whitmore talk about her like a commodity. She had not known the world was this large or this real or this full of the specific kinds of things that make a life worth looking directly at. A sound behind her, and Seth came around the bend of the trail, having caught up from the cabin where he had been finishing some task or other. He came to stand beside her at the pool's edge, and he looked at the waterfall the way he always looked at things, with full, patient attention. Clara said she wanted to see the big water, he said, looking at his daughter on Alice's hip. She did, Alice confirmed. Clara was looking at the waterfall with enormous eyes. Seth put his arm around Alice's shoulders, the comfortable, habitual weight of it. He looked at the ledge behind the falls the way she had been looking at it. I could see you plain as day, he said. From right about here, he nodded to a spot 2 feet to his left. The light was coming from behind you through the rock face, and you were sitting with your knees pulled up, and you were still, but not like someone resting, like someone deciding. I was deciding, she said. I just didn't know what I was deciding yet. I stood there a while, he said, before I called out, wasn't sure you'd come. He paused. But I thought if somebody was hiding behind a waterfall in a wedding dress, they probably needed a different door to walk through more than they needed to be sent back the way they came. She leaned into the solidity of him. You told me the world was bigger than my fear. He looked at her. Not exactly. Not in so many words, she agreed, but that's what you meant. He considered this. I suppose it was, he said. William looked up from the pool. Papa, why is the water white? Seth crouched down beside his son and began explaining, in the patient, exact way he explained things, about current and rock and the mechanics of falling water, and William listened with that focused blue gaze that was going to turn gray as he got older. Alice knew it already from the hints at the edges of the iris. Clara leaned forward from Alice's hip toward the waterfall, one hand outstretched in the direction of the spray. Big water, Clara said firmly. Yes, Alice said and held her daughter more securely. Very big water. It goes on and on. She looked at the falls, at the white curtain of them at the ledge behind where she had once sat and cried and then gone still, and then found something on the other side of all the noise and fear that might be called her own life. She looked at her husband crouching beside her son at the pool's edge, the great breadth of his back, his voice patient and warm as he talked about how water moves. She thought, I came out from behind the waterfall. She thought, The world was so much bigger than the fear. She thought everything that mattered happened on the other side of running. The afternoon light was warm through the canyon, and the spray from the falls caught it and made brief, small rainbows at the edges of the curtain, there and gone and there again. William saw them and pointed and said something joyful and wordless. Seth straightened up and put his hand at the back of Alice's neck, warm and sure, and she turned and looked at him, and he looked back at her with those storm-gray eyes, and there was everything in that look that there had ever been between them and more besides, and the mountains were enormous around their small, complete world. "Ready to go home," he said. "Yes," Alice Ford Holloway said. "Let's go home." They walked back up the South Trail together, the falls growing quieter behind them as they climbed, the pines closing in their cool and their green, the hollow opening up ahead with the house and the garden and the apple tree, everything exactly as they had built it, stone by stone and season by season. The world above the hollow was vast and full of weather and time, and they walked into the clear center of their own life under it, all four of them, in the late mountain afternoon, with the last of the snowmelt in the creek and the long summer still ahead.